Hey everybody, I'm Bob.
And I'm Brad. We're the hosts of the Film and Whiskey podcast, and we're just so excited because we've been doing this for about 6, 7, 8 months now, and we have some big, exciting news for you guys, and so we just kind of want to give you a couple updates about the podcast as a whole.
Yeah, just here at the top of this episode, we thought that we would give you a couple announcements, and the first one is that we have joined a podcast network,
which we are super excited about. This is such a great opportunity to collaborate with other creators, and the network that we have joined is called Robots Radio. So Bob, why don't you tell them what Robots Radio is all about?
Yeah, so Robots Radio is a small but growing network of podcasts, and all of their podcasts have to do with nerd culture. So on the network, you're going to see podcasts about gaming. You're going to see podcasts about even something like board gaming, I think, is on the podcast. There's actually one other movie podcast on the network called Fresh Tomatoes, where they look at films that have Rotten Tomatoes scores, and they try to find something positive in them. So we're super excited to be joining this network. You know, if you've listened to the podcast, you have heard me go on and on in my nerdy way about movies, and I think we fit right in. So what this means is that you're going to start hearing a couple advertisements for other shows on the network. And usually we're going to play those at the midway point or at the end of each episode. So just be prepared to hear a couple advertisements, but please check out the other podcasts on this network. They are all great. They've all been produced at a super high level, just like you would come to expect from Film and Whiskey.
And we've really just realized that this is such an awesome opportunity we have to collaborate with other people on making cool, fun, and interesting podcasts. So we're just so excited to bring you that. We've updated our logo to represent the change.
Yeah, and speaking of changes, we are actually in the process of making a 4 to 5 minute podcast trailer that is going to show up as the preview episode for the podcast in your player. So currently right now, you will see that we have a preview episode that we recorded back in February on Anchorman. And that was never really intended for us to release as a full episode. It was something that Brad and I just did one day for fun to see if this Film and Whiskey thing might work out. And that preview episode has really served us well, but what we found is that it doesn't really reflect the quality that you all have come to expect from the show.
If you absolutely love the Anchorman episode, you can go ahead, go to the Simplecast, our Simplecast page, and you can download it right now and keep it forever. Listen to it at your heart's content, but that will be coming down in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so that's it. We are about to get into our episode on Humphrey Bogart's classic, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Bob, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, enjoy. We love you guys. Thanks again.
Robots Radio presents...
In 1948, director John Huston and star Humphrey Bogart gave the world a tragic tale about the fruits born out of greed.
In 2019, we sample a flagship bourbon that could be a gateway to liquid gold.
The film is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
The whiskey is Four Roses.
And we'll review them both.
This is the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we're looking at the 1948 film, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Brad, I feel like this is one of those movies, you know, it's one of my favorite older movies. And I feel like it's had such an impact on culture, and yet at the same time, it's one of those movies that I don't think anyone has really heard of before.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched the movie recently, and I don't think I've ever heard of it.
Yeah, it's just not one of those titles that comes up when you hear the list of classic movies. It just doesn't come up in the conversation with, you know, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, Vertigo, and yet it's just as highly regarded as any of those movies. You know, when the Library of Congress started this thing called the National Film Registry in 1989 to basically like preserve movies that they thought were culturally important to the United States, this movie was inducted in the second year of existence for that thing. So it's like people certainly hold this movie in high regard, and yet at the same time, I think if you ask the average person on the street, like, name more than one movie that has Humphrey Bogart in it, I don't really know if this movie's coming out of their mouths.
Yeah, and it's really sad to see that, because honestly, I'll give myself away right now. It's a really good movie.
Oh, it's so good. It's one of my favorites. So I'm glad to hear that, you know, you hadn't heard of it and that you also really enjoyed watching it. Brad, what were your kind of initial impressions of the movie as you went into it? Did you have any idea what it was going to be about? Did you know the plot in advance?
For some reason, just the title and the cover art for the film kind of gave away the fact that it was gold mining or something about, striking it rich out in the Wild West. I didn't know that it was in Mexico, even though you probably could have gotten that from the title, Sierra Madre.
Well, that's okay. We forgive you for that.
Well, But yeah, long story short, I went into this movie without many expectations. I didn't know what was coming my way, and I was blown away. I think one of the things that makes it difficult to be accessible to the common public is just the fact that, I don't know, man, old movies are just made so very differently than modern movies.
Yeah.
And I think that really comes out in this film.
Yeah, and I noticed it in the way that John Huston, the director, kind of put this movie together as well. He wasn't making this movie in like the conventional way that you would have seen movies made at that time. This was actually one of the very first movies ever to be filmed almost entirely on location outside of the United States. They went to Mexico. They were roughing it, kind of in the wilderness out there. John Huston kind of prided himself on being like a rough and tumble guy. And he made, all of his actors go out hiking with him in all of these scenes. And this movie was like exorbitantly expensive because of that. But you see it also in the way that Huston kind of directs a scene. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but it almost struck me as like a foreign film. The way that the first couple scenes are paced, it was like lots of cuts, lots of weird camera angles as you get the feel for what this, city street in Tampico in Mexico looks like. And you just immediately are put into this world where you're like, whoa, old movies don't usually flow like this. There's something different about this one.
And that's truly thanks to director John Huston. Now correct me if I'm wrong, he was the director for African Queen, correct?
Yeah, he directed The African Queen, and then before this, his first film, his biggest, most well-remembered film would be The Maltese Falcon, which he also did with Bogart.
Right, and so would you say that one of Huston's legacies is the fact that he really promoted the format of actually filming in a location that truly translates to the viewer what it's like to be in a foreign country?
Absolutely, yeah, and I mean, you just can't beat the authenticity. And I think part of that is why this movie has such a different feel because, when you watch a Casablanca or any movie made in that era, your mind doesn't know it, but you're watching something that was filmed on a soundstage and all of the camera work reflects that. Whereas in this movie, like when you're watching somebody walk up the side of a mountain, you're watching someone walk up the actual side of a mountain. And no matter what kind of fancy camera work they try to do, there's only so much that you can work around nature. And so it really does give this film a completely different vibe and feel like throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, the scene that I think of when you talk about that is when the fourth member of their group briefly joins them and they're ready to kill him, but then he points out, hey, there's bandits coming up the mountain, and they give you that beautiful camera shot of the entire mountain, and you see the bandits on horses, a few miles away.
Right.
And that shot gives you the sense of how big the set is, that you're not on a soundstage, that you're actually out in nature. And it gives credibility when, Walter Huston says, well, it'll probably take him an hour to get here. We should probably eat some food first.
Yeah, right.
And that like makes sense. You're like, oh yeah, they're really far away. It'll probably take them an hour to get here.
So I don't want to go too far into the details of the plot, especially for people who are listening to this and haven't seen the movie yet. So why don't we hit the brakes right now and go to our favorite segment, Brad Explains The Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
I think that we might need to rename the segment Brad Spoils The Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Brad spoils the movie that's 71 years old.
That's right. Oh, yeah, we forgot to mention this is the 71st anniversary.
It's a big one. It's a major milestone. You're the worst. Just do Brad Explains.
So, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre is a movie that starts off by basically just following Humphrey Bogart around a town in Mexico, and he's just a hobo. He's a drifter that asks people for money, and he ends up striking it rich with the lottery. And with that money, he decides that, hey, I should probably take this money, buy some donkeys and equipment, and go prospecting with my other hobo friend and this crazy old man we found in a bar who talked to us about prospecting. I mean,
that's pretty much that's the setup. That's the setup for the movie, and then
that's the entire setup.
Yeah, and then where it goes from there is essentially, everything that Walter Huston's character, Howard, and that would be the crazy old man that they find, he basically gives this speech about the power of gold to corrupt people and what happens to people's, psyches as they go out and try to prospect. And the rest of the movie is that basically becoming a prophecy and coming true. And you watch these three men go out into the wilderness and slowly lose their minds as they look for gold.
Yeah, and the movie succeeded. I think the only reason the movie is good is because the three main performers in the movie, Walter Huston, Humphrey Bogart, and I can't remember the third guy's name.
It's Tim Holt.
Tim Holt. They turn in three of the best performances I think I've ever seen.
They're all fantastic. And the great thing about the roles that they're playing is, they're not all super complex characters. Like, you get the sense from the beginning that Bogart's character is this loud, brash, kind of morally corrupt guy that's capable of doing bad things, and that's exactly what he becomes. Walter Huston's character is the wise old prospector who seems, insane, but is the most sane one of all. And then Tim Holt's character, and I actually think Tim Holt is the character that anchors the movie down, because he ends up becoming who we as the audience latch onto, because he's the only one that kind of keeps his sanity and has a good heart throughout the movie.
Yeah, for sure. The moment that you really latch on to him as a character is when the cave-in at the mine happens and he almost turns and leaves Humphrey Bogart to die.
Yeah, so they're just starting their sort of prospecting journey. They've basically created a mine in the side of the mountain, and it caves in on top of Humphrey Bogart. And you're right, Brad, you get this wonderful scene where Tim Holt is calling into the mine, Dobbs, which is Bogart's character's name. And for just a second, he turns his back, and you get the sense of oh, gold is starting to corrupt even this guy. And then all of a sudden you get this great musical cue of the camaraderie theme that you've heard through the whole movie, and he runs back into the mine to rescue Humphrey Bogart. It really is. It's a great beat in the movie.
Yeah, and that, I will say, that brings me to one of my points of how old movies are so much different than new. In older movies, it is so much more obvious what the director wants you to feel with music.
Yeah, but you know what? I kind of wanted to talk about this too, because I almost feel like the music in this movie is too much. And it's really catchy. I love all the different themes, but it beats you over the head with what it's trying to do.
Yeah, but I guess the thing for me is I feel like that happens in a lot of older movies.
Oh, for sure.
Where the music is just, like you said, it beats you over the head with this is how you should feel. And we talked about On the Waterfront a few weeks ago. I felt very similarly about that movie, that whenever you were supposed to feel good, you had a nice upswell in the music. Whenever you're supposed to be scared, there was a nice little, up and down wavery, oh man, what's going to happen next, piece of the music.
Right.
And so these older movies, they just hit you over the head with music is showing you how you should feel.
And yet, at the same time, I think this is where Huston's decisions as a director really shine, because he makes the decision that not a lot of people did back then to completely drop out the music at really crucial moments. And it's always when there's a really suspenseful scene happening, and he knows exactly when to make it just silent. And it happens probably 3 or 4 times in the movie. One of the first times that it happens is, Brad, you were referring to this earlier. There's a point in the movie where one of the characters, Curtin, Tim Holt's character, has to go down into town and buy supplies, and someone notices him down there and follows him up the mountain and tries to become part of their group. And they're sitting around the campfire that night, and Tim Holt is recounting to the other 2 guys, yeah, I think that guy followed me. And all of a sudden, the music cuts out, and you see that the guy's standing right there by his camp, and you have no idea what's going to happen. But the tension is so ratcheted up because you do get rid of that sort of bombastic music, and you're left with nothing but the silence that all these guys are sharing with each other.
And that silence, I think, mimics real life oh crap moments.
Yeah.
Where, obviously we don't all run around with music playing in our head, but if we did, they would stop when we feel like we got caught doing something we shouldn't be doing or we're in trouble for something. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. All right, so maybe this is a good time for us to kind of walk back to the 3 lead performances that we've been talking about. So we're talking about Bogart, we're talking about Walter Huston, and Tim Holt. And I want to start with Humphrey Bogart because he is, the major Hollywood star. He's been at the top of the heap since Casablanca really catapulted him into the stratosphere. And he takes a lot of risks here. I mean, he's the villain of the movie, and yet he's the first person you see. We're dropped into the movie, and we think that we're going to be sympathizing with and following his character of Dobbs all through the movie. And really what the movie's about is watching this guy Dobbs go from kind of, a jerk of a guy to being a completely insane murderer. And for someone of his stature to take on a role like that, I think was super gutsy.
Yeah, I think you could almost call him a lovable loser at the start of the movie. And by the end of the movie, he really does turn into this murderous, psychotic, mumbling to himself, crazy person that is the villain of the movie who tried to kill the man who saved his life.
I know you for what you are. For a long time I've had my suspicions about you. Now I know I've been right.
What suspicions are you talking about?
Oh, you're not putting anything over on me. I see right through you. For a long time you've had it in your mind to bump me off at the first good opportunity and bury me out here in the bush like a dog. So you could take not only the old man's goods, but mine in the bargain. And when you get to Durango safely, you'll have a big laugh, won't you? Thinking how dumb the old man and I were. You make another move toward me and I'll pull the trigger. Now get your hands up. Come on, get 'em up! Was I right, or was I? You and your Sunday school talk about protecting people's goods. You. Come on, stand up and take it like a man. Come on, get up!
What's really funny is you call him a lovable loser at the start of the movie. And I think maybe it's because I've seen the movie before that on this watch, I knew where his character goes. But because he's the first person we see, I think the audience tries to forgive some of his rough edges and try to sympathize with him. But on a second watch, you can kind of see from the very beginning, the signs are all there of where this guy is going to go. Like the Mexican kid that comes in and tries to sell him the lottery ticket, he's been out on the street asking for meals from all the Americans and basically like manipulating the same guy over and over to give him money. And then this kid comes in to tries to sell him a lottery ticket and he says, "Get away from me, you little beggar." And he like chases after him. And it just shows how much Dobbs has absolutely no self-awareness or is in denial of who he is. Like, he's clearly just as much a beggar as this kid is, but in his mind, he's above that kid. And it comes out, like, the foreshadowing in this movie comes out time and time again. When they're all in, like, the flop house together, and Walter Huston is saying, "I've seen what gold will do to people. You'll never stop wanting more." And Dobbs kind of drunkenly says, like, "Oh, I'd only get what I set out to get." Immediately, like, that's BS. And, watching it a second time, exactly that he has no idea what he's in store for.
Yeah, I suppose it's one of those situations where you kind of see his character during rough times, but when the true, difficult, hard times come out, you see that who he always was is what comes out in the hardest of times.
Yeah, definitely.
So the big thing for me with this movie about Humphrey Bogart as an actor, this movie actually made me very glad that I gave Casablanca a 9.5.
Why is that?
Looking back on Casablanca, I really struggled with, should I have given it a 10? It's such a great movie. I don't think Humphrey Bogart turns in half as good of a performance in Casablanca as he does in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
I would agree that his performance here is the better performance. I also think it's the showier performance, so we're kind of looking for it a little bit. But I'm in complete agreement with you, Brad. This is, in my opinion, like the best performance of Bogart's career.
Yeah, and you get it right away. He actually like raises his voice. Like in all of Casablanca, he just kind of uses this low, gravelly, like, he almost sounds drunk the entire movie of just like, "Oh, what are you doing in my bar of all the gin joints?
Yeah.
I'm Han Solo."
I was going to say, I love how he sounds like elderly Harrison Ford.
Yeah, for sure. But like in this movie, he actually gets excitable and he speaks loudly and he speaks softly and he just works the camera and he works his voice in such different ways that I love this performance by Bogart, even with him being the villain.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not the only showy performance in the movie, because you've got Walter Huston there as the old man Howard, who is like every bit chewing the scenery as Bogart is. What did you think,
Bro?
What did you think of Huston's performance?
He is hamming it up.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he just, like you said, he just chews the scenery up. He doesn't care what's happening around him. He knows what his line is, and he knows the type of character he needs to be, and he throws it in your face every time he laughs, every time he delivers a line. Yep. I mean, he's just spot on.
And it's funny because I feel like I've seen this character 100 times, but then when you trace it back, they all have their origins in this Walter Huston character. Like, I don't want to undersell his performance either, because it is fantastic.
Yeah, he honestly reminds me a little bit, or I should say this other actor reminds me of Walter Huston. Joe E. Brown in Some Like It Hot.
Oh, interesting.
Like just the way he laughs and he hams it up. And granted, it's a comedy versus a drama, so it's different. But like just the way he hams up the older male character.
Right.
It just screamed Walter Huston to me. And
the funny thing is, Walter Huston had been, he was a classically trained actor, and he was an Oscar winner. He had been a leading man, and, getting into his older years, he still felt like he was a leading man. And so when his son, the director, John Huston, came to him and said, Dad, I want you to play this supporting part, and also you're going to be playing like the old stinky prospector, and also I want you to take out your dentures in the course of the movie, so it seems more authentic. Like, he didn't think he could do it at first. And so it's kind of like with Bogart. They're playing against what people are used to seeing them play, but I think they do it to such incredible results that you don't question the decision that John Huston made.
I've dug in Alaska and Canada and Colorado. I was with the crowd in the British Honduras, where it made my fare back home and almost enough over to cure me of the fever I'd caught. Dug in California and Australia, all over the world practically. Yeah, I know what gold does to men's souls.
You talk as though you struck it rich sometime or other, Pop. How about it? And what are you doing in here, a down and outer?
That's the gold. That's what it makes of us. Never knew a prospector yet that died rich. Make one fortune, sure to blow it in trying to find another. I'm no exception to the rule. Sure, I'm an odd old bone now, but say, don't you guys think the spirit's gone? I'm all set to shoulder a pickaxe and a shovel anytime anybody's willing to share expenses. Rather go by myself. Going it alone's the best way. But you gotta have a stomach for loneliness. Some guys go nutty with it. On the other hand, going with a partner, too, is dangerous. Murder's always lurking about. Partners accusing each other of all sorts of crimes. As long as there's no find, the noble brotherhood will last. But when the piles of gold begin to grow, that's when the trouble starts.
Yeah, so can I throw something at you, and you can confirm if I'm right or wrong?
Yeah, sure.
Toy Story 2. Yep. The character, is it Stinky Pete?
Stinky Pete. Oh,
tell me that he was not based 100% on Walter Huston.
It was totally a throwback to Treasure the Sierra Madre. Like, and the Kelsey Grammer voice isn't the same as Walter Huston, but the design of that character, 100% Treasure the Sierra Madre.
Yeah, as I was watching Howard, I was like, man, there's something about him that seems so familiar. And like halfway through the movie, I put my finger on it. I was like, oh, it's Stinky Pete from Toy Story 2.
That's exactly right. And, you said that he was hamming it up. And I actually, I think that's probably the best way to phrase it. There's one point in the movie where I just cannot forgive Walter Huston or John Huston. And it's like towards the end of the movie, they're getting ready to come in from prospecting and cash in all their gold. And these Mexican villagers come and say, there's a sick boy. We need a healer to come and take care of him. And so Howard's like, well, I've got some experience in that. And he goes off with the villagers. He saves the boy, and the villagers make him stay so they can honor him and treat him like a god, basically. And in this scene where they're pampering him, Walter Huston takes a puff off of a pipe, or he takes a drink out of a coconut or something, and he looks right at the camera, and he winks and goes brrr. And I couldn't believe that in the middle of this super suspenseful, dark, cynical movie, that this man looked right down the barrel of the camera like a Bugs Bunny cartoon, and they left it in the movie. It is unforgivable.
Yeah, I didn't understand that either. If that had happened like at the start of the movie, maybe.
Yeah.
But like we're right in the serious part where
It pulled me
where
out of the
Humphrey
movie.
Humphrey Bogart has just killed Tim Holt in cold blood.
Right.
And you just have him hamming it up, winking at the camera, winking at this young girl who's lighting his pipe.
It was the most
kind of like, whoa.
It was the most jarring thing in the whole movie. And yeah, it really did pull me out of the movie for a minute.
Well, it felt like an outtake that should have been left on the cutting room floor. Or like, John Huston keeps it for his private collection and laughs with his dad when they watch that and go, ha ha ha, remember when you winked at the camera?
Yeah, and they just left it in.
Yeah, that was amusing to me.
So let's round out our discussion of the three main actors here. I want to talk about Tim Holt for a minute. His name is Bob Curtin in the movie. They call him Curtin the whole movie. Tim Holt, in my opinion, like I said earlier, he anchors the whole movie down. He gives the most grounded performance, and you kind of have to because you can't be at the intensity level of either one of those other two actors. Like, someone had to balance it out, and I don't think people give Tim Holt enough credit for what he does in this movie.
Yeah, the depth of his character, I think, really is shown best at the very end of the movie when they've ridden back to the ruins and they're looking for their gold, and Walter Huston just loses it, and he's giving us that ridiculous laugh, and he finally just says, the earth has taken back what we took from it. Ha 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 ha. That's so funny. And you see this path from anger and frustration to acceptance and understanding in Tim Holt's face that any regular, American watching that movie would say, yeah, I could do the same thing. I could come to terms with losing out on 35,000 gold.
Right.
And there's something about that character that he works the camera perfectly. He bounces off of Humphrey Bogart so well. Like, he's so calm and cool and collected in the face of Bogart's madness that he really does ground the movie and anchor it in reality.
And he's the only one that they really give these emotional speeches to. Or I don't even want to say emotional, but like hopeful. Because like Howard gets a couple speeches where he talks about what gold can do to a man's soul. But Curtin is the guy who reads the letter from the fourth guy, Cody's wife, after we find out that Cody's been killed by bandits. He's reading about, like, little Timmy wants you to come home and keeps asking, where's dad? And it's such a cheesy scene, but the way Tim Holt gives this movie a little bit of, like, gravitas and emotion, you buy it coming from him. Like, he is the only thing that gives this movie an emotional punch, because otherwise I feel like it would be almost too dark and too cynical to really succeed.
Yeah, I feel like the three characters are set up so perfectly that they're almost like caricatures of what we want to see. With Walter Huston, you see the person who you almost see this. This might sound weird, but he's almost like an angelic figure that is trying to send a message to Humphrey Bogart and Tim Holt. He comes in, he tells them the danger of gold, he tells them the danger of greed, and then he just lets them play it out. And you see in Humphrey Bogart and in Tim Holt the two results that can happen. You can be tempted by the gold and turn away from it, or you can be tempted by the gold and give in to the madness.
Yeah, definitely. So, Brad, we have so much more to talk about in this movie. We haven't really gotten into John Huston's direction. We haven't talked about our favorite scenes. We haven't analyzed what this movie is all about. But I think that in order to really get into the treasure of the Sierra Madre, it's time for us to drink a little bit of liquid gold. What do you say we try this Four Roses Yellow Label?
The only gold that truly matters.
Amen.
Let's get into it.
All right, so today we are checking out Four Roses Yellow Label. Now, this is just standard Four Roses, but they call it Yellow Label. It used to actually have a yellow label. They've redesigned the package. It has this weird cream-colored label now. I don't know. Don't shoot the messenger, but that's what we're drinking today, Brad.
Why do you think it's 4 roses? Like, why not 5 roses?
I almost looked up the origin of the name Four Roses before we hit record, but I did not do it. So next time we have Four Roses on the show, I'll have an answer for you. But today, I have no idea.
Hey, man, that's okay. We all have our faults.
So Four Roses clocks in at 80 proof. The website says that it's aged for a minimum of 5 years. It runs $21.99 for a fifth in the state of Ohio, so it's a super affordable whiskey. Like I said, this is their baseline standard whiskey. Now, we have a fantastic friend on Instagram called Bourbon in College. If you are not listening to his podcast, go check it out. If you're not following Bourbon in College on Instagram, go follow him right now. But Bourbon in College has actually sent us 4 different samples of Four Roses. So maybe that's where the Four Roses come from, Brad.
They probably rebranded after he sent us the 4 samples.
They knew exactly what he was doing. So he sent us a sample of their standard yellow label. He sent us a small batch. He sent us a single barrel. And then he also sent us a small batch select. So at 4 different points in the coming weeks, we will be trying 4 different kinds of Four Roses, thanks to our friend Bourbon in College.
Yeah, tonight's drink goes out to my boy, Bourbon in College. Go check him out.
All right, so let's get into it. Brad, what are you thinking about this on the nose?
Ooh, it smells boozy.
Does it really smell boozy to you? See, I'm smelling mine, and it actually doesn't give me a lot at all. It seems kind of low proof. I mean, I know that it's only 80 proof, but I don't smell a lot of ethanol. There's not a lot going on here.
I was just pulling your chain, Bob.
Well, my chain has been pulled, my friend. So what are you actually thinking about it?
Honestly, I'm getting a little bit of like vanilla and butterscotch.
That is so crazy. I'm not getting any. So I have a lot of oak. Like I'm just smelling oak barrel and almost like a seawater kind of smell, like a saline smell. But not a lot of vanilla, not a lot of brown sugar, not a lot of maple. It smells a little bit spicy, like maybe there's a higher rye mash bill. And I get a little bit of fruit on it, but I'm not getting those classic vanilla notes that you are.
Yeah, I don't understand that. For me right now, I'm picking up some of the vanilla. I do pick up a little bit of that spiciness that you're talking about. I can sense that, but yeah, a little bit of vanilla and butterscotch, I feel like.
So what kind of a score would you give it on the nose, Brad?
I'm going to give it a 7 on the nose. I think it has a nice, pleasant, it's not offensive. It doesn't hit you very hard. I like the nose pretty well.
Well, that's good. I'm actually only going to give it a 5 on the nose. For me, it's not doing it. I wish that there was a little bit more complexity. I wish I was picking up some of those things that Brad's picking up. But for me, it's just a 5.
Yeah, so what do you think about taste? Let's give it a swig.
All right, so first thing I'll say is it's really thin.
Yep.
And it's not very sweet. It's a little bit peppery, like I get a little bit of a tingle from it, and I don't think that's the alcohol. I think that, like we said, there might be a little bit more rye in this than we're used to, but I'm just getting tons and tons of oak. This tastes underaged, and I'm surprised that it says that it's 5 years minimum, because I would have sworn this was like a 2-year whiskey. Just, it tastes like oak that hasn't mellowed.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. It's a little bit thin. You can tell it's watered down to 80 proof. And I still taste a hint of the vanilla and butterscotch, but I'm getting more of that pepper and more of that oak that you smelt on the nose.
I will say the second and third sip of this, I really, really like. It's an easy sipper, and that's because it's 80 proof. It doesn't have a ton of character on it, but it's not bitter. It's not unpleasant. It's not that astringent, like harsh ethanol taste. It just kind of tastes like it hasn't been aged long enough. I don't know how else to explain it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I'm going to give it a 6 on the taste. It tastes fine. It's solid. It doesn't quite live up to the nose. But yeah, it's easy sipper. That's the best way to describe it.
I think I'm going to give it a 7 on the taste. I don't dislike this. It just doesn't really have a ton of character. But again, for an 80 proof $21 whiskey, like what do you really expect? So I like sipping on this. I think it's something that I could have a couple glasses of and be satisfied. So I'm going to give it a 7 on the taste. And that brings us to finish, which I kind of felt was almost non-existent. Like I said, it's not bitter. It doesn't leave a bad taste in your mouth. It does have that sort of spicy oak flavor to it, but it evaporates pretty quickly. which if you're looking for a long, complex finish, you're not going to find it here. But if you're looking for something that you can just continually sip on, this might be right up your alley. It just depends on what you like on the finish.
I can't say anything that you didn't just say. I mean, it's an easy sipper. It goes down smooth. It does not sit on your palate for very long. You can almost feel it evaporating as you're swallowing. It disappears pretty quick. And that is a little bit of a disappointment, but for $21, I'd say it's about right on what I'd expect.
I would say the same thing. Brad, do you generally consider yourself to be a guy that enjoys a longer finish or one that fades pretty quickly?
That's actually a really hard question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I guess it depends on whether or not you like the taste, because, if it's, like, for me, a really heavily peated scotch, like, those have super long finishes, but they just remind me of how much I hated the experience of drinking it. So I hate the finish on those.
Yeah, for sure. And, like, when you have a rye that's just, 99% rye, and it sits on your palate for 5 minutes after you're done sipping on it, I don't know if I enjoy that.
No, same thing. But again, I wish there was a little more going on in the finish on this particular whiskey. So I'm just going to give it a 5 on the finish.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 6 on the finish. It lingers just long enough to remind you what it did for you, but it doesn't stick around for very long.
All right, that brings us to overall balance. We're talking nose, taste, and finish on this. Brad, how do you think this stacked up when all things are considered?
This is a really well-balanced whiskey. For all of its pitfalls, I think that the nose and the taste and the balance all tell me exactly what they're going to do up front. They don't trick me into thinking it's something that it isn't. I'm going to give it an 8 on balance. It's very honest about what it is.
Yeah, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to give it an 8. Like you said, I'm not expecting a ton out of this, and I think that might be kind of boosting my score a little bit. But no one part of this stuck out, which says a lot for a cheap whiskey, because usually either it's going to smell too harsh on the nose, or it's going to taste too harsh, or it's going to finish too harsh, but it was fairly mellow. And that may have something to do with the 80 proof, but I think it still says a lot that it was consistent from the time I nosed it to after I swallowed it. So I'm going to go ahead and give it an 8 on balance as well.
Yeah, and when we come into the final category of value, I think I initially started to think, man, this is pretty good value. But then I really started to think about other whiskeys I've bought in the $20 to $24 category. And there's a lot of other whiskeys and bourbons I think I'd rather be drinking.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that a $15 and a $20 whiskey would be that different. But if this was something that was like sitting next to Jack Daniel's or Jim Beam on the shelf at $15 to $17, I would think this would be an astronomical value. But I mean, I paid, or I guess Bourbon in College paid as much for this as we would have paid for like a Weller Special Reserve. And we weren't super high on Weller, but at the price point, I would take Weller over this any day of the week.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm going to give this a 6 on value. It's not, it's not fully average. It's above average value, but it's just okay.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 7 on value. I do think that it's definitely above average. I still like it. For the price point, it's not terrible. I do wish it was a few dollars cheaper, but it's not like they're gouging people for what they're providing.
Yeah, I totally agree. So that brings me out to a 33 out of 50. Bob, what does that bring you to?
That brings me to a 32 out of 50.
Yeah, so we're like right on par with each other. I think we kind of think the same thing about this whiskey. It's good. It's above average. It doesn't sit with you very long, but it's a good, easy sipper.
Yeah, I mean, we come out to a 65 out of 100. And, when you just look at the score, it makes it seem like this is a mediocre whiskey. I don't think that's the case at all. Most of our scores have been in that 60 to 70 range, except for ones that we really, really don't like. And I think to say that something is a 65 out of 100 and you only have to pay $20, $21 for it actually says quite a bit about what they're able to do at such a low price point and at such a low proof.
Yeah, and if you are looking for an easy sipper, this would be one I highly recommend. And I guess to get to our recommendation in general, I would recommend this. I think it's a solid whiskey that you should try at some point.
Yeah, I would too. And, we're not going to be trying these 4 different samples of the Four Roses line in consecutive weeks, but this makes me excited to see what happens when we get into a small batch, when we get into a single barrel that are going to be at higher proofs, because what we're getting at 80 proof, I'm really, really excited about.
Yeah, and it excites me that big companies are willing to make products like this that are still really high quality, but a little bit lower on the price. Because I think it's easy to get into this attitude of, well, if I can't spend $100 on a bottle of, liquor, then it's not worth it for me. Well, not many people can do that. Most people are in the category of, I'm looking for something I really want to enjoy, but my budget for, non-essentials isn't super high. So what can I enjoy? And if you're in that category, go buy some, Four Roses Yellow Label.
Absolutely. Well, we both recommend. I actually really enjoyed that. Thank you again to Bourbon in College. Brad, what do you say we get back into talking about the treasure of the Sierra Madre?
Let's do it.
So that was Four Roses Yellow Label. Brad and I both recommending it. And Brad and I both recommend this movie, Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Brad, there's a lot of different directions we can go, but I just want to take a minute and talk some more about John Huston's direction in this movie. One of the things that I'm shocked by every time I watch this movie, it's not just that it's a really dark, kind of cynical movie, but it's that the only word I could think of to write down in my notes was brutal. It's just, there's such brutality in this movie, and it doesn't have that sort of classic Hollywood sheen of the violence is covered up and you don't see anything. I mean, you get it like really early on in the movie when Bogart and Tim Holt's characters have been working like hard labor for this guy who's supposed to pay them and then stands him up, and they find him, they track him down in a bar, and they just beat him to a pulp. And that fight scene goes on for like 4 minutes. And it's literally like, it was like a Goodfellas stomping of this guy. And it happened like 40-something years before Goodfellas was filmed. I was shocked at how brutal that fight scene was.
Oh, for sure. And I think maybe that scene is why you have hope for Humphrey Bogart's character, because they didn't just rob the man blind. They took the money that he said he would pay them for working on the oil rig, and then they left him the rest. And then they paid the bartender and said, hey, thanks for the use of the bar. We apologize. We're heading out. And so there's that kind of hope that he's not just going to, be a greedy son of a gun, that he's actually a decent person at heart.
I've thought about that scene a lot after it. And part of me wonders, though, if it's because Tim Holt was there with him, because he pulls the money out of that guy's wallet and he's counting it out. And he says, like, what does he owe us? 300? And then Tim Holt says yes. And then he says, okay. And part of me wonders if Fred C. Dobbs had beat that guy up on his own, would he have felt the need to be as upstanding, or would he have just robbed that guy blind?
And I love that you said Fred C. Dobbs there. I think one of the best caricatures of his character is when Humphrey Bogart says a few times throughout the movie, well, I'm Fred C. Dobbs and I have my rights.
And he says it like he is somebody, like you're supposed to know his name.
Right.
But just going back to that fight scene, the first thing I wrote down in my notes was about the guy that they beat up, because he starts the fight. He knows he's cornered and he hits, I think, Bogart like over the head with a bottle. And the first thing I wrote was, why would that guy throw a punch against two guys, like knowing he's going to lose? And I came to the realization that like this fight scene is a foreshadowing of the whole movie, because that guy is so greedy and so protective of his money that he will get himself in a fight that he knows he can't win just to try to protect what little bit of money he has. And it shows early on the lengths people will go when they become obsessed with wealth, with money, with gold. It was actually a really, really interesting piece of foreshadowing that you might not have seen like on first glance.
Yeah, I really was interested by John Huston's choice to split the movie in two, that you have that foreshadowing. I mean, it's like 40 minutes of the movie when he's kind of a hobo and he finds that job working on the oil rig, and then they beat that guy up, and that kind of transitions you into the second half of the movie. But like you said, the first little bit of the movie is a full, foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the entire second half of the movie. And you're right, it's a brilliant use of foreshadowing that you don't even realize until after the movie when you're talking about it on a podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And I think part of that goes back to the fact that this movie was adapted from a novel of the same name. And as you watch it play out on screen, you really do understand that, like, yeah, this definitely came from a book, because if this was an original screenplay, I can just see some executive somewhere saying, cut this, get us out into the wilderness quicker. But they really take their time setting up the themes of the movie. And as you watch it, you may not understand exactly where it's going, because it does seem like it takes forever to get out there. But once they get out there, they can get you plunged really quickly into the greed, the suspicion, the denials, the frustration, the jealousy, because they've set those things up so well on the front end of the movie.
Yeah, I will say one of my frustrations with the movie is that there are certain times where Humphrey Bogart's character makes assumptions that I just shake my head at, and I'm like, man, like, you're jumping at shadows, and not in a way that would make any logical sense. But maybe that's the whole point, is to say that, you know, the greed for gold brings about madness and, you know, illogical thinking. I don't know.
I struggled with some of those scenes as well, and for me it was because I didn't think the writing was fantastic. Like, the dialogue didn't sound natural, and Bogart does his best with that, but there's so many times where he's like, "Ah, yes, I see that your plan all along was for me to get descended upon by bandits," and it's like, who thinks to talk like that when you haven't slept in 4 days?
Yeah, that is the best way of putting it. A lot of the dialogue just felt stilted whenever he was getting angry and upset about things.
But I will say that I do think, from a director's standpoint, Huston does such a good job of introducing this kind of creeping sense of dread that you know something's coming, and it really happens well in the close-ups that he uses. Like, I'm thinking about the shots in one of the first nights when they're all back in the tent, and they decide to split all the gold up 3 ways, and you see Walter Huston pouring the gold into the bags, and they're all watching the bags. They're already like licking their lips looking at this gold, and then you see their eyes dart back and forth to each other, and it's like they're already suspicious of each other. And you know, like, right from that point on, there's no way this can end well.
Yeah, there's something about the directing of this movie. I loved the phrase you used, a creeping sense of dread. This movie really reminded me of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, with his use of silence, with his use of, you know, slight bits of humor to like offset the horror that you know is about to unfold. Like, the entire time you know something bad is going to happen, and it's a suspenseful movie. And I haven't seen a suspenseful movie like that outside of many Hitchcock films.
I actually think that's a really good comparison, because Hitchcock really liked to toy with the audience. And, you know, a lot of times he walked that fine line between really suspenseful, horrific things and really darkly funny things. And I feel like there's one scene in this movie, you know, the scene where they've all hidden their goods out in the wilderness, and they don't want each other to find out where all their goods are hidden. And one night, you know, one of the characters wakes up, and one of the other characters is, you know, out relieving himself or something. And it starts this scene where each guy has to get up and go out and check on whether his goods are still there. And then the other guys are waking up and getting suspicious. And at its core, that's a comedy scene. Like, that's the kind of thing you would see in like a Marx Brothers movie. But Huston takes it, and the actors play it so straight that it plays for suspense. It's a really, really suspenseful scene, but at its heart, like, it's actually a comedy routine.
Oh, for sure. There, you could see the Three Stooges doing that exact same scene, but they'd be moving a lot faster, and everybody would be laughing at them.
Yeah, for sure.
But Huston uses it in such a way that you just kind of feel this creeping dread of, you know, is one of them going to shoot each other in the middle of the night? You know, what's going to happen?
And I think that kind of gets us into like our final analysis on the movie. You know, I've said a couple times that this is a really cynical movie. And I don't know if cynical is the right word, but I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out the overall message of the movie. Is it just that greed corrupts, or is there something more going on? Because, you know, Brad hinted at this earlier in the episode. The end of the movie is that it ends up that Humphrey Bogart tries to kill Tim Holt's character. Holt doesn't actually die, but Bogart ends up with all of the gold, and then he gets descended upon by bandits. They murder him. The bandits don't recognize that the gold is what's actually in the bags. They think it's just, dust, and they scatter it to the winds. Walter Huston and Tim Holt come riding into town, and they find out all their gold is gone, and they laugh at the irony of everything. And on face value, it kind of seems like a really nihilistic ending. Like, all of this has been for nothing. It doesn't really seem to give a lot of hope about what all of our work is for in life.
I think that for me, I read a more positive ending into the movie, that, all the wealth in the world is not worth the value of your soul.
Curtain, old boy. It's a great joke played on us by the Lord or fate or nature, whatever you prefer. But whoever or whatever played it certainly had a sense of humor. The gold has gone back to where we found it.
And Humphrey Bogart loses his soul to the corruption of wealth. And, Tim Holt is able to resist that, and he's able to go on to do good in the world. Walter Huston's character says, hey, I'm going to give you all the money that we get from selling the donkeys and pretty much everything that I have. And why don't you go up to Texas and call on the widow of the man that we kind of, in a sense, killed?
Right.
And, pay her respects and tell her about how her husband died. And then why don't you go off, and enjoy what you wanted to enjoy all along, which was peaches and fruit season.
Yeah, and I think that a good microcosm of that is even earlier in the movie when that fourth guy, Cody, dies. And it happens in the course of bandits coming to attack their camp. And they fight all the bandits off. And they're like in the midst of celebrating winning this battle. And then they look down and they remember that there's a dead guy there at their feet. And it's their, this guy, Cody. And they just kind of look at his dead body and say like, oh, what are we going to do with this? And Bogart looks down and says, oh, yeah, him. And it reminds you that in Dobbs's eyes, human life ultimately is really cheap. Like, he doesn't care one bit about that guy. And then you see Tim Holt pull the letter out of his pocket, read the letter. It gives that character a backstory. And it reminds you, even at that point, that there are some things that are more important than the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of gold. And Dobbs clearly doesn't see it, even if the other two guys do.
And I think that truly is the moral of this story, is that there's things more valuable in this world than money and wealth. And that it's not worth giving up your soul for something that is so transitory, and you have it one day and you lose it the next. And that the important things in this world are valuing human life, of caring for one another, of truly taking care of one another in this life. And you see that in Tim Holt, and you see the lack of it in Humphrey Bogart, and the movie tells you what each type of life gets.
Yeah. So, Brad, why don't we go ahead and score this bad boy out? I'm excited to hear what you thought of it. What kind of a score would you give this movie out of 10, and would you recommend it?
Yeah, I mean, starting with the bad, there are certain parts of this movie where, Walter Huston is hamming it up and he's looking at the camera. He's also doing some sort of weird medicine man ritual with this little boy where he's raising his arms up and down and like...
We didn't even talk about that. That scene for me... First of all, it's like 48 minutes long. It's so long.
Yes.
And when you look at what he's actually doing, like literally all he's doing is making the kid do like jumping jacks. And that's like that's his form of medicine.
Yeah, Walter Huston knows how to do a magic that I have no clue about. So there's certain things like that, and certain parts of Humphrey Bogart's dialogue that we already said was pretty rough when he gets kind of maniacal. So it's not a perfect movie. However, is it a 9 out of 10? Yes. This is a phenomenal movie. It tells a good story, and I think it offers a very important message that is applicable to all humans in all times.
Yeah, I'd go one step further than that. This used to be, at one point in my life, this was like in my top 10 movies of all time. I do think I've come down on a little bit since then, but I would still give this movie a 9.5. You know, if you remove that ridiculous breaking the fourth wall by Walter Huston, and some of those lines of dialogue, like you said, this movie is nearly perfect, and it was doing something at a time where movies just didn't do it. Like filming on location, getting into this really, really harsh, cynical look at greed and the brutality of violence is stuff you didn't see in a movie in 1948. And that, I think, is what helps it hold up in 2019. So I'm going to give this movie a 9.5. That brings our average out to a 9.25. So I think we'd both definitely recommend this movie.
Yeah, highly recommend. And like I said earlier in this movie about like Clint Eastwood, you don't have the gritty realism of Clint Eastwood if you don't have, you know, the treasure of the Sierra Madre.
For sure. But we want to know what you think about this movie. So please, give us a shout out on social media. Brad, where can they find us?
They can find us on all the social media platforms at Film Whiskey with an E.
At Film Whiskey with an E, or give us a call on our call-in line. We'll play your voicemail on air. Who knows? We might even agree or disagree with you. Our number is 216-800-5923. That's 216-800-5923. If you like what you're hearing from the Film and Whiskey podcast, please go over to Apple Podcast, to Google Podcast, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review. We'd love more and more people to become part of the Film and Whiskey community and find out about what we're doing here. Next week, we'll be back reviewing the 1961 musical classic, West Side Story. For the Film and Whiskey podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
We'll see you next time.
There is one thing I want to say about Humphrey Bogart.
Is there a way that I can like lead into it, or is it just going to be like a random observation?
Probably a random observation.
You're so mysterious.
You know me so well. No, I'm just going to say he looks exactly like Hugh Jackman.
What? Are you serious?
100%. He looks exactly like Hugh Jackman with a beard.
You're insane, man. Have you seen him without the beard?
No.
He looks like a potato.
Humphrey Bogart or Hugh Jackman?
Humphrey Bogart. Hugh Jackman looks like he was chiseled by the gods. Humphrey Bogart looks like if you melted the plastic on a Mr. Potato Head. And then left it to bake in the hot Mexican sun for months.
For 10 months in a gold mine?
Exactly.
If you just look at his face in this movie, he looks exactly like Hugh Jackman with a beard.
I'm going to make a poll out of this on Instagram. We're going to see what people think. This is going to be the outtake for this episode.
Perfect.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you like bad movies?
Do you find yourself defending bad movies, saying things like, well, the soundtrack was okay, or the costumes were pretty fun?
From the previous hosts of It's Not That Bad podcast, we bring you Fresh Tomatoes, the movie podcast, from Simone LaRue and Chad Ekovitz.
Every week, we review 2 movies that did not do well critically, but we say, hey, there are some nice things about them. Maybe Rotten Tomatoes was wrong.
Maybe they're all fools, and you should watch these movies regardless. We'll also talk about scenes that could have saved it, and we'll often refer to Simone's cats because they're amazing and adorable, and we love them.
And at the end of each review, we will tell you whether we would watch this movie again, or in what circumstances we would recommend you watch this movie.
So, join us on July 9th for the first drop of our main episode, and then 2 days later for our drop of our minisodes.
And on Robots Radio Podcast Network. Come see us on July 9th. We love you so much already. Bye!